Here she is.
All right, and then like we usually do, we'll start with just a few minutes of sort of meditation. Just very briefly, first turn our attention to the breath just for a moment. And what I would want to suggest doing today is to turn one's attention to um, your own mind, particularly though the mental factors. So what does that mean? So um, no, I start to take notice. Am I distracted or am I tired? Or is the quality of my mind clear, focused? Is there um, desire or loving kindness? Some other, right? What mental factors are there? Hmm. Let's take a couple minutes, right, to start to notice like what mental factors are present in each moment. And as you're being aware of your own mind now, see if you can actually watch as like, say, not the thought itself, right? Like when a thought arises, what happens? Can you see how your attention goes to the thought? And then is there a virtuous or a non-virtuous mental factor in mind associated with that thought? Mhm. sometimes we study, right? Like attachment, aversion, ignorance. Here you're looking, is attachment or aversion or ignorance present in my mind in this moment, for example? And if, as you're introspecting, for example, if you find that there is, say, attachment or aversion or ignorance present in your mind, then notice what's that like? What's the actual experience like, right, of that mental affliction? Like, can I see for myself? Is it an affliction? And like the Buddha said that ignorance, attachment, aversion, and the certain minds associated with them are mental affliction. Mm. What does that mean in my own experience if I check my own mind? Mhm. The Buddha said that those kinds of mental afflictions in one's own mind are like a prison that keep oneself trapped. So you check. Mm. Is that true to my experience? Mhm. And the Buddha also said, right, a mind free from mental afflictions associated with attachment, aversion, and ignorance is in the nature of freedom. Happiness. So what is that? What would that be like? Or what is that like? Can I experience a mind free from all mental affliction, even for a moment? And what's that like? You know, again, you're asking these questions for yourself, like introspecting in your own mind, your own experience of mind. Like at any given moment, what's it like to be to have a mind controlled by mental affliction, or to have a mind without mental affliction? So in this context, right, you think compassion. So compassion is the wish, actually, to free myself and others from the mental afflictions. Or another way you could say, like, definite emergence or renunciation is the wish to free myself from the mental afflictions. That's self-compassion. And then the wish to free others from mental afflictions, from being trapped by them, would be compassion. The wish to free all beings from mental afflictions would be great compassion. Mm. So this was final part of this meditation, but let's take a moment to see, can you cultivate that kind of self-compassion or and compassion for others? And to what extent can you get an experience or have an experience like that or not? And if not, then why? What's going on in your mind that doesn't allow for that kind of compassion to arise? And again, it's just noticing, right? What's your own experience? If you try to cultivate compassion for yourself and others. So we can come to a more interactive mode. So it's like a beginning of just starting to explore a tiny bit about the fourth foundation of mindfulness, right? Mindfulness of phenomena. Um, and I think where to start. Well, I'll start with that and come back. There were questions from last time, I think, still, but we'll start with this. So, right, so that we've been covering the four foundations of mindfulness, and we've covered the first three. So today we're covering the fourth. See it. Right, which is the mindfulness of phenomena. And actually, mindfulness of phenomena covers an infinite number of things, doesn't it? Like phenomena, I mean, there's phenomena like dharmas in Sanskrit, right? So things, right? Phenomena, existent phenomena. So in one sense, that covers uh, an infinite number of phenomena. But there are a number of points that are made actually. So and we said right in the four foundations of mindfulness, you're practicing, or you're being mindful of them, right, with a kind of wisdom that analyzes or looks at the general and specific characteristics. Um, so there, again, and there are many methods taught, teachings of Buddha for this. But one way of looking at the specific characteristic of phenomena is that they're selfless. And there are different meanings of that, right, according to different tenet systems. Um, so one way, like from the lower tenet systems view, right, self as a phenomena can mean that there's no self-sufficient, substantially existent person in phenomena, right? Or another way of saying it too, and then there's another way of looking at that too about phenomena, which is that there's no self-sufficient, substantially existent owner of phenomena, right? So there's nobody, so like there's no self-sufficient, substantially existent, independent person who owns. And actually, it feels like there is, of course. Like like actually it's funny, like if you own something, then it feels like there is a self-sufficient, substantially existent person who owns it, because you have to like work, you start worry about it. And you like, oh no, like I always thought that, right? Like if you watch somebody, say in a car dealership, and they don't own the car, then they have a certain one relationship. But if, let's say, they buy the car, and as soon as they walk out, somebody damages it, then there's like this feeling, right? But if somebody damaged a different car, they would think, oh, it's not mine. Who cares? So it feels like there's a self-sufficient, substantially existent owner of things, right? Um, so anyway, but there is none. So that's one way of looking at phenomena, right? Is that it seems like there is one, but there's not, right? And also within phenomena, there is no self-sufficient, substantially existent person. Um, and then from the Majjhimaka perspective, there's also a teaching that there's no um, inherently existent phenomena, right? That selfless is a phenomena, which is not taught in some of the lower tenet systems, but is taught there. So anyway, there are many different meanings. I guess I'm just saying that I said selfless of phenomena, but there are many different meanings to selfless of phenomena. But how would you, so like one example of meditation then, right, is if you meditate, say, and this is taught in some of the texts, like, so one version of meditating on phenomena would be you might meditate on the five aggregates, trying to see, is there a self in the five aggregates, right? So you're looking at the five aggregates and you're asking, and there's many various meditations like that, right? But if you're analyzing like form and feelings and discrimination and so on, and saying, is there a self-sufficient, substantially existent self there? That would be an example of just where you're meditating on phenomena, in that case, the five aggregates, looking for a self. Um, but there are infinite ways that we'll get to, but that's one example of meditation on phenomena. And then, so that's one way of looking at, and I said this with each of them, there's been two different ways of looking at the specific characteristics. So one is, what you said, they're selfless. Another is, it says here, I'll read you the quote from the commentary. This is a quote about it says the close placement through cultivating the close placements of mindfulness of phenomena. When you understand that all thoroughly afflicted phenomena are discordant classes, and all completely pure phenomena are antidotes to them, you will understand that these very antidotes are the methods for turning away from harm and will generate them and will act to generate them. So this is another way of practicing, or another explanation of how you practice the specific characteristics of mindfulness phenomena. So what's that getting at? That's what we were just doing, by the way. So one is what how they say it here, when you understand all the thoroughly afflicted phenomena are discordant classes. So that's a kind of, I don't know, in English, that's might take some time to figure out what does that mean, right? But what that's getting at actually is this: is thoroughly afflicted means in the nature of mental afflictions, right? Or connected to the mental afflictions, you could say, because it doesn't have to be it can either be a mental affliction itself or something connected to a mental affliction in that sense. Like, so for example, an example of something connected to a mental affliction would be your own aggregates. Like sometimes your aggregates are actually like your mind has a mental affliction in it, but even when it doesn't, it was created by karma and mental afflictions, your aggregates. So they're connected to the mental afflictions, and that mental afflictions naturally arise for our us, because of that. Whereas for Buddhas, they don't, for example, right? Um, so thoroughly afflicted phenomena and are of the discordant class. It means they're discordant with liberation, with freedom, right? And so you have to check like that. This is why I think I just love the four foundations of mindfulness is so that's what the Buddha said, right? But like, um, you have to check for yourself and see if you agree. Does that make sense? Like, so you have to see that now, like, when you study like Buddhism, you study that, right? Okay, there's suffering and the cause of suffering. What's the cause of suffering? It's mental afflictions. Here, you're practicing the Four Noble Truths or that in relation to your own experience in the moment, right? So you're checking, are the mental afflictions in the nature of, are they discordant with freedom, right? You have to check for yourself. And so you see, like, is that my experience or not? And if not, why? Like, so and if it is, why? And I was hesitating about. Like I remember once, many years ago, I remember talking with my father. He's died, yeah, years ago. But I said to him, I said, he struggled, or struggle is wrong word. He had he had strong experiences of anger, and one day I was saying to him, like, I think your anger causes you a lot of suffering. Maybe it'd be better for you if you were more patient. Like, it looks like it's causing you a lot of suffering in your life. And he thought about it. We had a long conversation. And he thought about it. He was open. He was great. He was very open to having a real conversation. And "No, I've come to the conclusion my anger keeps me alive. I need to be angry. It's how I grew up. It's what keeps me alive, and it's what I'm going to do." And I said, "Okay, it's up to you. I'm not one to tell you what to do. I'm just sharing my opinion." And he said, "Yeah, okay, good." And so we were practicing. I was trying to practice with him a mindfulness of phenomena, and he came to that different. He came to that conclusion. I'll share. I remember then when he was dying, he was suddenly incredibly patient for the first time ever. I'd known him his whole life, or my whole life rather, not his whole life. And then he was dying, and he was so patient. Like he was the kind of person who would, if a waitress was late, he would scream. Oh yeah. And then he's like dying in hospice, and the people are late, and he's in pain, and he's just, no, it's okay. I said, "How are you so patient?" He said, "Well, I don't have to stay alive anymore. So I don't need that." Good point. He was smart. He was right. Like for him, I mean, he was observant of his own mind. My point why am I telling that story? It's just a story. But my point is like, we have to be honest with ourselves. Does that make sense? Like, so you check for yourself. Like the Buddha said, all your mental afflictions are the cause of your suffering. But you have to check. And if you're honest with yourself, what you're going to find, at least as part of you, is like my dad. There's some mental affliction you're going to agree. You're going to say, no, I need that one. That's the mental affliction that helps me survive, or that helps me win, or that helps me get ahead, or that helps me whatever, right? Have what I want. And mindfulness of phenomena means, if you're doing the first one, right, thoroughly afflicted, because what it's saying is the thoroughly afflicted phenomena are of the discordant class, right? Discordant with freedom. So you have to check for yourself, is my point, deeply, right? And say, wow, and like I always think that it's easy. I just find this funny. It's really easy to do that with the things you already don't like. Like, for example, like, let's say, I'm trying to give an example. Okay, like I don't like oysters. I'm just picking an example, right? So it's really easy for me to say, "Oh, attachment to oysters would cause this." Oh, I don't eat that. Like, there's no problem. Just picking an example, right? That's no problem. It's really easy for me. The hard thing is to look at what am I attached to, right? And is that discordant with my own freedom? right? And that you have to look very deeply at and analyze your experience moment by moment and ask yourself honestly, was the Buddha wrong or am I wrong? What, is this actually causing me happiness? What does happiness mean? Or what does liberation mean? So that's this point, thoroughly afflicted phenomena are discordant classes, is very deep, actually, right? Well, because what you're actually checking is what is the nature of the mental afflictions and do they cause me suffering or not? And then the next part, and all completely pure phenomena are antidotes to them. So what are completely pure phenomena, right? Like, and so from one perspective, that's wisdom understanding emptiness, right? But you could also include there, from a different perspective, the mental states that can increase infinitely, like love. So you have to say, like, for example, like, is love, because love is discordant with anger, for example, and hatred. Right? So you have to check, like, what's the experience of love like? Here, you don't just say, "Oh, I love," right? Like, you actually say, what's the in the moment experience of love like, and is it an antidote to something? And does it lead me to some kind of happiness, some kind of well-being, or not? And I remember, like Lama Zopa Rinpoche would say, the moment you cherish others, which is love, that's the meaning of cherishing others is a synonym in Buddhist language for love, right? So he said, the moment you cherish others, you have so much peace in your heart, right? He said, that very moment, you don't have to wait till later. It's right there at that moment. So, and I remember at the time I thought, oh, is that true? Like, I don't know. Like, let me check, and then I had to go, wow, sometimes what I think is love isn't love, actually, because it doesn't cause peace in my heart. Right? Like, so I was like, oh, I thought that was love, but that's not love. That's something else. I was mistaking something else for love. And then when you have the experience of love that cherishes others, you go, oh, that's what love is. And that's an antidote to something else. That's concordant with liberation, or compassion. What is compassion, right? And like you have to check, so you see what I'm getting at? These are like very deep experiential questions that you have to explore in your own experience. So like when you have a mental state, mindfulness of phenomena, there are all kinds of phenomena, right? But these here, this commentary, this point is saying the most important phenomena are your own mental states. Right? So you check like what is loving kindness, for example, and what's that like in the moment, and is it in the nature of peace, and what's that like compared to, say, desire, craving, and then you check, wow, craving, we think we crave because it makes us happy. We think that, right? But then you check, is that true or not? And what's it like to have a mind without craving? And you have to check for maybe for I know for me it's be like, well, can I have a mind without craving for like how long can that last and what's that like? And then how quickly what happens when craving comes back? And then you check, you keep noticing, right? And what this is getting at is if you don't do that, then of course it's because it says then you will generate these very antidotes that are the methods for turning away from harm, and you'll act to generate them. So what this is saying is if you don't practice mindfulness of phenomena in this way, then you won't act actually, right? Because you won't know. Because you're not gonna if you're not actually aware in your own experience, oh, this is what makes me feel free and peaceful and liberated. This is what makes me feel trapped and keeps me stuck. If you don't know that from your own experience, then you won't actually take an action to cultivate like concordant classes with liberation and overcome or apply antidotes to the discordant classes because it's not your experience. And it's like what's the word? Then it'll just stay like that particular teaching, which is the core teaching of the Buddha, will remain like a book learning or something. It won't actually be your experience, and then you won't get the peace. Actually, is the point. Like it's not that's not to say like you're being a bad Buddhist and like this, right? That's not that. It's not like that. It's saying this is about your own liberation, actually, really here. And also the other thing I'll say is that it's funny is like because if you check this way, right, and then if you think, oh, I have compassion for others and I want to liberate them from suffering, but then you don't even want to give up the cause of suffering in your own experience because you haven't analyzed it, then it has no meaning. What is it like? That's why they say like Lama Tsongkhapa in the three principal aspects of the path says, the wish for your own emergence from suffering has to come first before bodhicitta. Because if you don't even understand what liberation will be for yourself, how can you wish it? And it's like a silly idea, right? Oh, I want everybody else to be free from the cause of suffering, but I'll keep my cause of suffering because I enjoy it. Like that's silly, isn't it? Like, um, so the mindfulness of phenomena is very profound practice, right? Um, and yeah, so um, I was going to quote something. I pulled up the text of the 8 verses of mind training. And many people have studied that text. It's a mind Loja mind training text. Um, but verse 3 says, "In every action I will watch my mind, and the moment a mental affliction or a destructive emotion arises, I will confront them strongly and avert them, since they will hurt both me and others." So the point here is like, this is why I told that story about my dad. Um, most of us don't practice that, right? In other words, when mental affliction, like actually when mental afflictions arise, we don't even notice that they're there. First of all, usually, most people don't, right? And then and then this idea, confront them and strongly avert them. And part of the point here is like, if you read that and you haven't done mindfulness of phenomena, it could seem like somebody's telling you, it could seem like Longri Tangpa, he's the author of this text. It's sort of, I guess I want to say something. He's not being moralistic, if that makes sense. What he's saying is like, they're the cause of your suffering, right? He's seen that from his own experience. So he's saying from his experience, those are the cause of why I and others suffer. Like, and so confront them and avert them because they're going to make you miserable. Does that make sense? And they're going to cause you to cause others suffering, right? Like, because that's what they do. Like where he says they will hurt both me and others, right? So he's saying if you don't notice the mental affliction as it arises and do something to counteract it, it's going to keep you trapped in misery, and then you're going to make other people miserable. So then there's no Dharma practice left, actually, right? If you're just making yourself and others miserable, there's nothing left that's practicing Dharma. So you have to practice mindfulness of phenomena, which means notice the mental afflictions as they arise, and then apply an antidote. And and then I'll read another. And then he says, I'm going to jump down to verse 7. He says, "In brief, directly or indirectly, I will offer help and happiness to all my mothers, or mother sentient beings, and secretly take upon myself their hurt and suffering. I will learn to keep all these practices untainted by thoughts of the 8 worldly concerns. May I recognize all things as like illusions, without attachment, and without attachment gain freedom from bondage." So he's talking about the mindfulness phenomena, really, right? And the 8 worldly concerns, actually, what are those? Those are the way, this is part of mindfulness of phenomena where we have to be very honest with ourselves, right? Because, the 8 worldly phenomena, 8 worldly concerns, he calls it, right? And it's really weird, isn't it? Like, I'll take an example, like one of the worldly concerns is wanting comfort and not wanting discomfort. And actually, like, like that's like for someone like me, that's my whole, like that's all I've ever done, mostly, right? Is try to be comfortable and not be uncomfortable. Um, Mostly like that, like I remember once somebody asked Geshe Lama Kuncho, who was a great yogi at Kopan, to tell his autobiography. Lama Zopa Rinpoche asked, no, I'm sorry. Lama Zopa Rinpoche said to him, "Can you tell your autobiography?" And he said, "No." That's what Lama Zopa said, "Please go tell your autobiography." So because he respected Lama Zopa Rinpoche, he came in and he sat down and he said something, I can't remember the exact word, but he basically said, like, people like giving me things. I prefer having nothing. People want to be comfortable. I don't care about being comfortable. I don't care if I'm comfortable or not comfortable. People like having a good reputation. I could care less about having a good reputation. I really don't care about that. And he did that over and over for various topics. And then he said, "I have nothing else to say." And then he got up and left. And that was his autobiography. Because he was free from the 8 worldly concerns. Um, and what he was getting at, I mean, I thought it was funny at the time, but actually he was getting at like, I'm not going to be a prisoner, right, of anybody's opinion. I'm not going to be a prisoner of some comfort. And he had actually, they said that he had for one point he had gone off to practice this, to practice mindfulness and phenomena to achieve liberation. And they said he was. I heard this. I didn't. He didn't tell me this. I heard from somebody else. There was a period where he was sitting under a tree somewhere in Nepal, and people. He was sort of. People were like freaked out. They were like, "Is that a person? Or what is that? What is that? Who lives under a tree? What is this?" But he didn't. He was just. He was a yogi, himself doing that. Anyway, but you don't have to. You could do that anywhere. Right? His point is, you have to. That's Dharma practice. That's what he was getting at. Because what this is getting at again, and like I just think it's very tricky because what it says, I will learn to keep all these practices untainted by the thoughts of the eight worldly concerns. Again, it could seem moralistic or something. I think if we're not careful, it could seem like Langri Tongpa is saying like some moralistic thing. But actually, what he's saying is like if you have the eight worldly concerns in your heart, in your mind, then you're trapped, right? Like, like so if your concern is like for reputation, well, you're a prisoner of what anybody else thinks of you. And just think one person not liking you and your peace of mind is gone, right? So like it's very profound what Geshe-la Kunshuk said, where he said, I don't care what anybody thinks, you know. Um, or the same thing, right? Like if you say my comfort, like it's comfort, right? Well then there was before people came, there was somebody doing construction, it was this loud noise, right? Then you're trapped by nobody can do construction work or I'm gonna be miserable. You're a prisoner of your own mind, actually, right? So here, being free of the worldly concerns is part of this mindfulness of phenomena. You notice, am I caught up in one of the worldly concerns? And if I am, you have to ask, is that causing me suffering? And then if you actually ask that, you have to ask, well, I think if you're honest with yourself in this practice, the harder part actually, one hard part is that actually a cause of suffering and admitting to yourself your own experience, checking honestly. The other hard part is where it says, all completely pure phenomena are antidotes to them. Because actually, most of us, like, do you have any experience of a completely pure phenomenon is the first question, right? Like, and and that's disturbing actually if you actually ask yourself that, right? Like, so like a completely pure phenomenon, for example, well, the main completely pure phenomenon is a wisdom understanding emptiness, right? But then if you go, well, actually, I've never experienced that yet, maybe, right? So then you have to say, well, okay, what would that be like? So you have to start analyzing and checking what is emptiness like, and then if you start to have even like an approximation that sort of approaches that, you go, what's the experience like? Right? That's one example of complete. But then what's more disturbing in a way, that at least you can say, okay, well, I haven't learned that yet. But then like just loving kindness, right? Like, because you might say, oh, of course I have love, but what is loving kindness in this context, right? Not what it like, love can mean a lot of different things, like, but what is loving kindness that's being talked about that gives peace immediately, right? And that is anyway, in this context, what I'm getting at is the loving kindness is not mixed with attachment, right? Have you experienced that? What's that like? Because if it's mixed with attachment, it's not what we're talking about here, right? So have you had loving kindness that's not mixed with attachment? Even how much of that? How long? And then I want to give one more. This is a homework assignment, and then I'll drop this. Then I'll switch gears for a second. But I want to give a homework assignment to people. You take it or not, of course. But I actually try. I want to ask people to experiment. One is of course notice the mental afflictions. That's obvious, right? But what I want to ask you to do is like to try something, which is like, are you to try something this week, which is pick an activity like brushing your teeth, something you do regularly, hopefully a couple times a day, maybe. Picking that as an example, or eating, or whatever, something that you do every day, and see if you can keep your mind in a state. I'm going to use the example of loving kindness for the whole time. Like so, the whole time you brush your teeth. How long do people brush their teeth? There's like it's like 2 minutes if you use an automatic toothbrush. I noticed that. My dentist told me that. He said to use one. He said it's 2 minutes. But so can you keep your mind absorbed in loving kindness for the whole length of time you brush your teeth? Just that long, 2 minutes, right? Um, for all beings. So that's a challenge and homework is that. Can you do that? And if not, what distracts you, what brings you away from loving kindness, right? Like, so you just think I'm brushing my teeth for the sake of all sentient beings, but not words, right? It has to be an experience of feeling loving kindness for all beings while you brush your teeth. Anyways, an assignment just that's mindful. It's a way to practice mindful phenomena um, in daily life, just a very small one. So actually, that's my challenge to you if you're willing to take it. Um, I'll pause there. There's a bunch more I want to say about mindfulness phenomena, but I want to pause. Any questions or comments before I go on? Lisa.
So meditating at the beginning, it struck me that as I was just trying to calm my mind and empty my mind, that it kept resonating and praying that as long as I am trapped in anything illusory, like the body, the world, like sudden stuff, and it struck me that they were really like prison. And as long as I continue to perceive my body or anything that I'm seeing as real, I'm in a prison. And in order to get past it, I have to be able to get past it, which I can't even do for a split second, let alone 2 minutes while I'm brushing my teeth. You know?
So can people hear? Oh, sorry. Lisa, I'll summarize because they couldn't hear. I think, tell me if I get it wrong, but I think what Lisa was saying was that you said, as long as I'm trapped in experiencing something illusory, right, like the body and the world, that then she was saying that her experience was that it's like being in a prison. Um, and I think you said that you can't even be free from that for a moment. And and I want to point something out, like that actually really parallels the language in the three principal aspects of the path by Lama Tsongkhapa. That's the goal, actually, right? Is to feel that way, right? He says, you know, when you meditate on the nature of samsara and you start to feel like you're in a prison, that's a good sign, actually, right? Like that you're practicing correctly. Because you are. Like in other words, that's what he's saying is like because you're finally seeing things real, not you, everybody is. When you get that experience of feeling like you're in a prison of your own experience, uh, for the first time in a way, like for the first time, one is seeing things realistically, actually. And and the good news, of course, is that you have the method to get out of the prison. Like you yourself can get out of that prison, because you've heard the Dharma teachings and so on. So, that like, but it's only once the person knows they're in a prison and doesn't like it that they start to practice, which is that's why, that the verse here says, um, once you do this practice, you will understand that these very antidotes are the methods for turning away from harm and will act to generate them. So it's like then you'll start to work to get out of the prison. And and I was going to say about that, like like when someone I guess Kuncho was this Lama I was talking about, right? Like when I was young and I was at Kopan and I heard these stories, he lived in caves and he wandered around the Himalayas. It just seemed cool. It's like, wow, that's really cool, something like that. Um, but I didn't really understand like the meaning, because like in other words, somebody else could wander around the Himalayas and who cares? It doesn't really matter, actually. It actually doesn't have any meaning at all. In and of itself, what matters is that he understood what you were describing, right? That he understood he was in a cave and he didn't want anything that would distract him from getting himself out. Um, and so he set up his life for himself in a way that would allow him to work with that so that he wasn't caught up in something that was going to keep him from getting free from that prison and then freeing others from that prison. And I was like, oh, that's the meaning of what he was doing. Not there was not anything. There was no other meaning to it, but that right that he understood. And it was like he didn't want to spend his time doing something that was going to further ensnare him in a prison and not let him then free other people from prison. He wanted to do whatever would help him liberate himself from that prison so that he can help others. And he knew the path to do that. So he was like, well, I'm not going to waste my time. And I was like, oh, that was the meaning of his life story, not something else, if that makes sense. So it's only through understanding that what you were getting at, this feeling like you're in a prison, that you start to really um, then think, okay, well, how do I get out? And then,
Even contemplating living kindness feels like I only contemplate it within these prison walls at the moment, you know, we'd like to break those walls over there. Like you're trying.
yeah, and of course the Buddha. So she was saying, how do you break those prison walls? And the Buddha's answer in the Four Noble Truths, is, I mean, there are different levels of subtlety, but actually, Shanti Deva, and it's interesting. I always thought this was interesting. Shanti Deva and the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, his main, text is mostly about compassion and bodhicitta and the way of the life of a bodhisattva. And then, I think it's the second to last chapter. We're going to study Shanti Deva at some point as part of this program, if people want. But in the second, I think it's in the second to last chapter, he gets to the part about wisdom, because he's covering the six perfections, so he goes through all the others first. And then when he gets to the perfection of wisdom, he gets to the point about the wisdom understanding emptiness, and he says something provocative, I thought, which was, for me, it was provocative. He said, Shanti Deva, who mainly focused on compassion, says basically, like, I can't remember the exact wording, but he basically says the wisdom understanding emptiness, the experience of that experience is the goal or the intent or the point of all these other teachings. I was like, wow, that's kind of a provocative statement. But in a way, what he was getting at is what you're saying, which is like, I mean, Shanti Deva had realized that, but what he was getting at was like, that's the only, like, there is no other way out of the prison than that. That's the key that opens the lock that gets you out of the prison. And then you can free others from the prison. But as long as you're still in the prison, as you were saying, you can't really free somebody else from the prison if you're still in it. And so Shanti Deva is saying it's the wisdom understanding emptiness is the final intent of all the other teachings, because it's what allows you to be free from that prison and then liberate others from that prison.
Something we have beyond.
Yeah. Yep. Lynn has a comment.
I had this strange experience. I had to go to the emergency room of Sibley it was preventative, but for sonogram. I hate hospitals. So I go to Sibley and they do the tests, find nothing, which is really good. Wonderful technician. I heard her whole employment history because that's the kind of law I do. So I she works really hard. She's working 12-hour shift near the end of the shift. She was so kind and sweet. So she says nothing's wrong, but you have to talk to the doctor. So I go back to the waiting room. The doctor never comes. 2 hours pass. So we say, am I going to see a doctor? So just because there's so many people in the same condition in this emergency. So they put me in a room and say the doctor will come. Well, another hour passes. So I decide I'm going to do the mantra of purification, right? And then I go out and I said, the doctor hasn't come. And then they said something that really made me feel bad about being impatient. They said, we deal with the most acute patients first. Basically saying you're not in any pain and you're not, the test turned out well for you. So just sit there in the room. Wait, doctor. And so I sat for another hour and then I went home, got the test in the morning because I didn't talk to the doctor. But on the way out of the hospital, and I felt really good. I was leaving the hospital 1:00 in the morning. So I get in my car and there's two beautiful stags and the empty lot across from the hospital. Wow. It was like magical. And I know I wouldn't have seen them if I hadn't let go of this impatience.
Two beautiful ones.
Stag. Deer.
Oh,
yeah, male deer. It was like Harry Potter. This is magic. But I know I wouldn't have seen them unless I had practiced this.
Right.
Yeah. It's sort of magical.
Wow. That's beautiful.
Yes. So I've always been a challenge for me when they say that the selflessness of phenomena, because I always think self of the that I can understand. Emptiness of selflessness, but the same term is used for phenomena. So I don't know if that's a translation issue, or could you provide any insight into why that term is used for phenomena as well?
Frank was asking about why he was understanding selflessness of persons because we grasp it as self of persons, but why do they call it selflessness of phenomena? Because you don't usually think of like a phenomena as having a self in that sense. Um, I think the answer to that would be there are different. Actually, I was starting to hint at this earlier, but so there. I think one point is that the answer to that would be different in different tenet systems of Buddhism, and so like so the two lower tenet systems, right? So the Vaibhashikas and the Sautrantikas, which are um, tenet systems of associated with the vehicles of individual liberation. In one sense, they don't. Sometimes it's said they don't teach a selflessness of phenomena, but but another way you could say some commentaries say they do in this sense, like what I was mentioning earlier, that there's no uh, self-sufficient, substantially existent self of a person that owns phenomena. They do teach that, so that like, so if you say this is my shirt, for example, they would agree there's no self-sufficient, substantially existent person who owns that shirt. Um, that's as far as they go in terms of selfless phenomena. So in that sense, when they say selfless phenomena, they mean there's no self that owns the phenomena. And that sort of fits with, you can see why you would use the word self in that sense. Um, but then the two higher tenet systems, like so the mind only school, you could say, or and the Majamaka school, they teach an explicit selflessness of phenomena, and they mean different things, by, of course, than each other. Each one of those two schools means something different when they say selflessness of phenomena. But then getting to that was one point. But then so from their perspective, it is an interesting term, isn't it, to say self of phenomena? Because actually let's look at it for a moment from this perspective of the mind only school, like because it's less subtle in a way. But like, so from that school's perspective, it's an interesting question. Like if one of us sees, like say, because you actually, I was getting it, like think of your own experience when you see a tree, object. And on the one hand, like I think what you're getting at is reasonable point, right? Which is I don't usually say, oh, that's like I don't grasp at this at a self of a tree in the same way as a person, right? Like I don't think, oh, that's although sometimes I guess maybe I don't know, it's subtle, but question. I remember sometimes we personify things, in other words, but what this is getting at in a way is like, what's that experience, right? And in the mind only school, right? When you see a tree out there, you feel it exists in its own right, apart from the mind. And the mind only school is saying it doesn't exist out there independently apart from your mind. Um, so that's what they're getting at in a way. Uh, so you have to kind of analyze what do they mean by self of phenomena in that sense, and each tenet system means something slightly different, don't they? Like because even like, but yeah, separate and cut off from the mind is sometimes how it's put, right, in the mind only school. So when you grasp at a tree, say, as existing separate and apart from the mind, existing out there, they would say that's that's an example of a self of phenomena that's not existent because it doesn't exist in that way. Uh, and then in the Madhyamaka school, you might, well, even those are sub schools, right? But if you were to say that exists intrinsically, it's getting at a slightly different meaning, maybe than cut off from mind, but that exists intrinsically or exists from its own side, So it's actually a different object of negation that you're looking at for a self of phenomena in those different ways. But that's what they're getting at, and so that's the term they use for that. But you have to get at the experience, which is not the same as the self person is exactly, or certainly not the same as the self-sufficiency of that self-sufficient, substantially existent self of persons. But then this raises something actually from last class that maybe I'll touch on for a second, because I think you're touching on an interesting question. And because there are different levels. What I was getting at there is there are different levels of subtlety to self, self, the meaning of self, right? And in some schools of thought, the self of there are different levels of subtlety to self of persons and self of phenomena, right? They talk about those as one being more subtle than the other. But in the Prasangika or consequentialist Madhyamaka school, self of persons and self of phenomena are equal subtlety. There's no difference in subtlety to those. And this was getting at the object of negation in a way. I've been thinking about this recently, and so I was just going to share because I was thinking of it's related, I think, somewhat to your question. Is in general, right? They say that the reason to refute inherent, the reason to prove emptiness, the most subtle king of reasons is dependent arising, right? Dependent arising is said to be they call it that, the king of reasons. Um, and just pausing because Robin, you were there when Rob was there a few weekends ago when Sharpa Choje Rinpoche was teaching to praise dependent arising by Lama Tsongkhapa. And he was getting at, there are three different levels of dependent arising taught. One is dependence upon causes and conditions, another is dependence upon parts, and another is dependence upon being merely labeled. So he made this point. He said dependence upon causes and conditions is taught in all Buddhist tenet systems. Dependence upon parts is mainly emphasized in the Sautrantika Madhyamaka school, and dependence upon being merely labeled is the reasoning unique to the Prasangika Madhyamaka school. And then this is the part I guess I just want to share that's related, I think, specifically to your question, is I want to go for a moment to dependence upon, you could actually use dependence upon parts or dependence upon causes and conditions for this next point I'm going to make. But I'm going to use depends upon causes and conditions for a second. If I say to myself or to anybody, right, well, if I say to some person, you arose, one of the causes and conditions two of the causes and conditions for your body are your parents, right? Like, your body, that's obvious, right? Your body arose in part dependence upon the cause of your parents. You couldn't be a human being without parents. So that's dependent arising, right? That's clear. That's dependent arising. And what's strange, though, is that as soon as you say parents, what comes to mind is inherently existing parents. So what's supposed to then be a proof of what you could use in theory as a proof of emptiness actually doesn't become for you. It doesn't become a proof of emptiness for that person because you see the cause is inherently existent. You see the result is inherently existent. So it's problematic, isn't it? Because dependent arising, which is supposed to be the proof that things lack inherent existence, but you see the causes and results as if they have inherent existence. And the same thing with parts. Like if I start analyzing my body and mind to see is there inherently existent self in it, eventually you can find there's not an inherently existent self, but all the parts of my body seem like they have inherent existence. And the parts of my mind too. Like, if I'm feeling really, actually the mind itself seems like it has inherent existence, right? That it exists, for example, dualistically separate from the object of mind. So that's the object of negation then. You see what I'm getting? So actually the object of negation from the Prasangika Madhyamaka school is what you're using to prove, actually the thing you're using to meditate to prove emptiness in a lower school, how you grasp at that becomes the object of negation in the Prasangika school, doesn't it? Then experientially. And I was like thinking about that recently. I was going like, I was trying to actually like notice it in mindfulness of phenomena in my own experience. So I was like, going, okay, I'm going to meditate on the emptiness of self using parts. It's like, wow, I can't not grasp at the parts. Every time I do it, I'm grasping at parts as if they have inherent existence. And then I can see there's no person there in that part, but I'm still grasping subtly at the part as if it has some kind of something that exists from its own side. So then you need the proof, so that self is a person's, I mean, a phenomena, right? Like all those phenomena, and their self of phenomena just means in that school's view, means it has some, just that it has uh, anything, that it what's the word, that it exists even for a single moment or in a single atom from its own side would be grasping at itself a phenomena.
That's Vatantika.
And then that's where then you have to apply the reasoning, right? That it exists in mere name as a mere appearance through interdependent factors with no inherent existence at all. Anyway, so then because that's a very subtle perspective on the self of phenomena. And what's weird is that they would say self of persons, we grasp it that same way. Like that there's actually not a difference from that school's perspective. Because it's anything that has any what's the word? Anything. And what Ling Rinpoche, the previous Ling Rinpoche, the senior tutor of the Dalai Lama, he said, and I read this, I met him, but he said, you know, the object of negation is that from that school's perspective, is that things exist as more than merely labeled.
Mhm.
So like when you grasp at things as existing as more than merely labeled, whether it's a person or a phenomenon, that's the self-grasping. That's the object of negation that has to be disproved, and the way to disprove it then is that it exists in mere name. So anyway, that's a very subtle presentation of that topic. That may have been too esoteric, but down a rabbit hole or something. um, but okay, well, I guess we should keep going. So then, a few other points I'll make. Mindfulness of phenomena. Um, Another point that is made in some of the commentaries is that it's actually an interesting point that the thoroughly afflicted phenomena um, come about due to are all arise due to misconception, according to Buddhism. So that all the thoroughly afflicted phenomena come into existence in dependence upon ignorance, grasping at things in a way that as if they exist in a way they don't.
Delusion.
And then and so in that sense, it's weird, isn't it? Because in one way, as Lisa was pointing out, they can seem like very solid prison bars, which in a way experientially stuck in samsara, they are. And from another perspective, they're very flimsy because they're not actually grounded in anything real. Um, and then the commentary makes the point that the completely pure phenomena are beneficial states to be cultivated, and they're realistic, right? They're not, which means they're not grounded in something unreal. They're not. They don't arise due to a misconception. And another point that's often made is that completely pure phenomena can be increased infinitely, because they're what's the word? Like so, and it's made in many texts. Actually, it's an interesting point, which I always think it's great to experiment with. Is like one point is because they're realistic, they're not dependent upon ignorance. Um, they're not flimsy once you cultivate them. But another point is that because of the nature of mind, like love can be increased infinitely. And and again, I just want to suggest that's really cool to experiment with, isn't it? Like, is that true? Buddha said so. Buddhist scholars say that compassion can be increased infinitely, genuine compassion, because it's not grounded in ignorance, because the nature of mind is such that it can become infinitely compassionate if that's what you cultivate. Of course, it's up to us if we want to try that. That's a wonderful thing to experiment with. And then, oh, the other point I was going to make is there are many different also, I just covered a few examples, but so one thing is meditating, you can use we had a class series on mind and mental factors. So one thing you can do is you can use that the commentaries on mind, they're like, the various minds and mental factors. One way of meditating on mindfulness phenomena is you notice what minds and mental factors are arising in this moment. So am I having equanimity? Am I having distraction? Am I having craving? Am I having dullness? Is my mind dull? What's the nature of dullness? And you look at, dullness is one of the mental, it gets in the way of liberation for you. It stops us from having meditative concentration. So you start to analyze those different mental factors, and then you notice, and then there are teachings on what are the antidotes, right? And you try to experiment with that. You say, let me try the antidotes with it. What happens? And in the teachings on calm abiding, for example, there are antidotes to meditative concentration and there are obstacles to meditative concentration. So you would experiment with that. Same with, the other mental afflictions like hatred, right? There are antidotes to it. So you experiment with that. That's one way of doing it. Others are, that you could meditate. Here, I'll read, as long as Dalai Lama says, from the Pali Sutras, there are 5 sets of phenomena that are sometimes included in mindfulness of phenomena. Those include meditating on the 5 hindrances, the 5 aggregates, the 12 sources, the 7 awakening factors, and the 4 noble truths. So those are, I'm just giving some examples. So you can see there are many examples of how you might go about meditating on mindfulness of phenomena. Yep.
To use the word ignorance several times, and I just looked it up real quick because I thought I knew what it is, and it did confirm that it means lack of knowledge. But I've been thinking that maybe it's a, but it's sometimes if I read too much or if I learn too much and get really muddled, and I need to stop way far and try to be more like a child, and just kind of like not know anything, and it's easier for me, to think about things sometimes. And so it just dawned on me that maybe ignorance isn't a bad thing. Sometimes it's unless I'm going about it incorrectly, but sometimes the more I know, the more muddled I am. So I want to embrace it all and be just clearer. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. Yeah. Lisa was asking about the nature of ignorance. And I guess I want to say in Buddhism, I think in the Buddhist context, this word ignorance has different meanings, really. But so sometimes it does mean what you're saying, which is like, like so you could say like a person could say, well, they're like, because she was saying that in English, sometimes ignorance can mean not knowing, right? That's what you said.
Lack of knowledge.
Lack of knowledge, lack of,
Yeah.
and sometimes in Buddhism it can mean that, right? Like, so you could say, oh, this person is, like you could say, let's say you're a student and you say, well, I'm ignorant of, I haven't yet learned what are the 12 sources, right? And so that would be that. And I see your point. So then I think I see your point. But there's a different meaning to ignorance. I think that's maybe more useful in the context you're bringing it up in, which is that ignorance in the context of Buddhism can be a misknowing. Like, so it's not just a lack of knowledge, but it's actually a kind of an incorrect knowledge. So like, and actually, I want to give two. I'm going to leave aside the kind of these esoteric points and make just draw a simple point about that. Like, because like, let's say I come across a stranger on the street, right? So I'm just giving a very mundane example. Like, if I recognize, well, I don't know anything about that person, um, I'm ignorant of knowing much about them. Well, that's a fair point, actually, right? And um, but there's a more, in a way, almost a more pernicious kind of ignorance in Buddhism, the kind of misknowledge, right? So in other words, if I come across a random person on the street and I develop a kind of, and I start to think, oh, because of say some prejudice I have, I think, oh, this person's terrible, and they're like this, and they're stupid, and they're whatever. I don't know anything about them actually, but I'm now projecting onto them a whole bunch of ideas that are actually completely wrong because I don't know anything about them, right? but not just because I don't know anything about it, because of my own prejudice, I'm sort of now imposing a kind of wrong understanding. And then based on that wrong understanding, I may mistreat them. And I think that's in Buddhism the more dangerous kind of ignorance is the ignorance. So there's an ignorance that we don't know something yet. But there's another kind of ignorance where we're superimposing things onto, and that's the one that I think that, so if you think of it this way, like, so your point about, is on the one hand, yeah, we don't have to, every single thing there is to learn, scholar was, but we do have to identify when we're doing that imposing, and catch it. And that's what that verse in the, it's part of what, one way of looking at that verse from the 8 verses of mind. When you start imposing on, or imposing something that doesn't exist, then we have to catch that and work with it, because that's quite dangerous, actually, isn't it? So I think, yeah, it's good to remember that there are two different, there are different types of ignorance, I guess. But I think your point is fair about the, sometimes it's easier to slow down. Yeah. Other, so how much more to cover? Maybe yeah, actually, I guess we can do that. We can finish the section. So I'll make just two more points then, and then we'll finish the section on the 4 foundations of mindfulness. So next time we can pick up with the 4 correct abandonings is the next of the 37 harmonies with enlightenment. But a couple more points I want to make. One is, so these 4 close placements of mindfulness, again, we can practice mindfulness at any time. We should practice mindfulness anytime. It's a good thing to practice. And to be mindful of these 4 phenomena anytime is wonderful and is what we should be practicing if we're trying to progress, But because the definition we started with was the 4 close placements of mindfulness are minds conjoined with a path, right? The formal sort of harmony with enlightenment, that's the 4 close places of mindfulness, begins when you enter the path of accumulation, which is the first path, right? So when you generate, if you're on the vehicle of individual liberation, it means once your mind is recognized you're in a prison and you're really striving for liberation, and then you're practicing these 4 close places of mindfulness to try to liberate yourself, that would be one version. Or if you have bodhicitta and you're doing it to try to achieve Buddhahood for the sake of all beings, once your mind is conjoined with an uncontrived either wish for your own liberation or with bodhicitta, and then you practice these, you're practicing the four close placements or 4 foundations of mindfulness. And you practice them then all the way up to Buddhahood, right? Because it doesn't matter what level you're at, you're still practicing mindfulness of phenomena and mindfulness of mind and so on. But they say that you become adept, you could say, at these when you complete the small level. There are 3 levels of the path of, just because we're also conjoining this with the 5 paths. The first of the 5 paths is the path of accumulation, right? And that has 3 sub-levels: small, medium, and great. And when you've gotten through to the end of the small level, you become very adept. You become adept at these 4 close placements of mindfulness. And that's in a way the measure of that, right? As you practice these very intensively in order to understand the Four Noble Truths, in order to understand your own mind, in order to understand the nature of affliction and liberation. And yeah, so when you've progressed enough that you're through the small level of the path of accumulation, you've kind of become adept at the 4 close placements of mindfulness. That's another point. And then the last point I was going to make, which I'm not going to cover this in too much detail, but I'll just say a little bit about it, is it's taught in various commentaries. One point they make is the 4 close placements of mindfulness are common practices. All these 37 harmonies of enlightenment are common to all the vehicles. So whether you're practicing the vehicle of the listeners, right, the hearer, the Shravaka, or the Prajeka Buddha vehicle, or the Bodhisattva vehicle, you practice all the 37 harmonies with enlightenment, including the 4 close placements of mindfulness. And so if you study the Pali Sutras, or you study the Sanskrit Sutras, you study the Theravadan or the Mahayana, it doesn't matter. They're all going to teach these. So then there are some commentaries, and it comes, I guess, from the Maitreya's Ornament of Mahayana Sutras, Mahayana Sutra Alamkara in Sanskrit. Maitreya says, well, what's the difference then? Is there a difference in how bodhisattvas practice these than how non-bodhisattvas? If you're practicing them just for your own liberation versus you're practicing them as a bodhisattva, is there a difference? And he says yes. And actually, I guess he lists 14 differences that of how in terms of how bodhisattvas practice them versus how you practice them if you're only trying to achieve your own liberation. Um, in brief, of course, one difference is if you're bodhisattva practicing them, you're practicing them with bodhicitta motivation. That's sort of obvious, right? So I can't help chuckling because it's obvious. Right? Whereas if you're not a bodhisattva, you're not practicing with bodhicitta because you don't have bodhicitta because that's not your interest. That's one point. But then that leads to certain differences, which I won't go into every detail, but I'll give an example or two. Like if you're practicing for your own liberation, you're practicing mindfulness of, say, body. Well, you mostly focus on your own body, right? On your experience of your own body. Whereas if you're practicing the Mahayana, right, then you would also focus, for example, on the suffering that others experience in their body, right? Because you're cultivating compassion, right? So you would recognize, oh wow, look, you would meditate. You might meditate on the suffering of people who are sick, and you would be feeling the unbearable compassion or the suffering of beings who are experiencing all different kinds of suffering. So there's a meditation. You know, if you're practicing for your own liberation, individual liberation, you're mostly focusing on um, your body and how it creates, how it's connected to your experiences of suffering. In Mahayana, you would be focusing on how other your and also others' bodies. You start with your own still because you have to, right? Otherwise, you won't understand that. But then you would also empathize with the suffering of others. Um, and the same thing with like mental afflictions, right? If you're practicing for your own liberation, you really just need to focus on what are my mental afflictions and how do I apply antidotes to them. Whereas if you're practicing in the great vehicle, Mahayana, you would be noticing and meditating on the suffering that others experience due to their mental afflictions, and you would be generating compassion, bodhicitta, for that, wishing to liberate them from that, and so on. And then another difference, I'm making some general points, I'm not covering all 14, but is, I was actually getting at Frank's question earlier to some extent. If you're practicing for your own liberation, they say you mainly meditate on the selflessness of yourself, right? Of yourself as a person. So you notice your own self-grasping and you start meditating on how to overcome that through wisdom, understanding that you don't exist in that way. Whereas in the actually they say that sometimes in some commentaries in the Great Via Mahayana, there are more. They say there are many more reasonings presented. It's just true, actually. If you look in the text, there are all these different reasonings presented to prove emptiness, because there's a much more vast. First of all, you're focusing on the emptiness of yourself, other beings, and all phenomena, right? Are explicitly taught, explicitly emphasized. And there's a more extensive reasoning because you're sort of more extensive contemplation because you're more, and if you think about it, because partly like if you're a bodhisattva, you're practicing the six perfections, right? So you're going to be practicing them in conjunction with the six perfections, right? So, for example, when you're practicing this perfection of patience, right, you're thinking about the emptiness of the harm giver, the emptiness of the subject of harm, the emptiness of the act of harm, and how harm itself lacks inherent existence. If you're practicing generosity, six perfections, you're meditating on how the giver, the gift, and the recipient are all mutually interdependent or mutually dependent and therefore empty of intrinsic existence. So there are all these different practices that bodhisattvas do that are only required because they're trying to achieve Buddhahood. And so they're doing all these other things like that, right? Whereas, if you're practicing just for your own liberation, you don't have to, may not do as much. You wouldn't be practicing as much generosity. That wouldn't be so relevant. So you wouldn't be meditating in that way. If that makes sense. It wouldn't be your focus. So those are differences. And then yeah, so and they give an example, like you in one you observe your own body, and the other you observe your own body and the bodies of all sentient beings. Um, another difference that they make, I'll just make a couple more points. Another difference they make is they point out is rebirth, right? Like in other words, as you're practicing the four foundations of mindfulness, if you, as least it sometimes takes many lifetimes to complete, well, in general, it takes many lifetimes to complete the path. And so they make a point in the individual liberation. First of all, you're trying to shorten the number of rebirths. You try to get out as quickly as possible. Uh, and if ideally you want to become an arhat in that life, if not, there are like once returners and non-returners. There are like there are different, you're trying to get quickly to arhat. So if you have to be a one returner, that's better than being a multiple returner in that system. Whereas in the Mahayana, you have the intention of practicing these four foundations of mindfulness while you continue to take rebirth to benefit others, right? Like it's only stana, right? For as long as space endures, and Shanti, he quotes Shantideva, right? For as long as space endures, for as long as sentient beings endure, may I too remain to dispel the misery of the world. So he often quotes that, right? So you're trying, and Mahayana Bodhisattva is trying to practice the four foundations of mindfulness while continuing to, they're not trying to shorten their rebirth, they're trying to continue to take rebirth through compassion to benefit others, and so on. And another difference, this is the last one I'll mention, is, in the individual liberation vehicle, when you think about the goal, it's nirvana, of course, right? Individual liberation is nirvana, nirvana, freedom from suffering. Whereas in the Mahayana, it's sometimes call it non-abiding nirvana, which is not slightly, it's quite a different goal. And a non-abiding nirvana means, actually, they sometimes say you're not, like you avoid the two extremes of, in this case, that means you're avoiding the extreme of staying in samsara yourself by, continuing to have mental afflictions and, and so on. But you're also avoiding the extreme of what they call individual peace. Whereas that you're not trying to have some kind of individual separate peace. You want to be manifest with others infinitely to benefit others. So there's a different goal in that sense, that Buddha doesn't want individual. They don't want an individual peace that's separate from others. They want to manifest limitlessly to benefit others for as long as beings are suffering. So it's a different goal in that sense. So anyway, there are various differences. And the point is not to put down the individual liberation vehicle. It's saying it's how you practice the four foundations of mindfulness. What it's saying is that bodhisattvas practice that exactly what somebody who's practicing their own individual liberation practices, but they need to add on. So, it's not saying you don't practice mindfulness in your own body. It's saying you do, but you also practice mindfulness of others' bodies. It's not saying you don't practice mindful awareness of your own mental afflictions. It's saying you add on of others' mental afflictions, for example. So, it's not a critique of that. It's saying you practice those things. Those are, sometimes we say common, you practice them in common with, if that makes sense. But then there are additional practices that bodhisattvas need to do because their goal is more extensive. So their practices have to be more extensive. So anyway, that kind of, I think in a kind of basic way, we've covered the four foundations of mindfulness. Are there any, I know we got to stop in a couple minutes, but any comments or questions before we stop? John has been. Volumes up.
Yeah, thanks. Get my mute off. I was really struck by that story you told a little earlier about your father, and I had a very similar experience with somebody very significant in my life, and they're still a part of my life, just not the way it was before. But just with the problems that we had, it kind of all boiled down to, I think, just this notion that, as your father put it, and that's why I was so struck by that that person's belief that anger is just an inherent part of human nature. And of course, that just flies in the face of Buddhist worldview as we've studied it, right? And then and we discussed this maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, but just the value of this close placement of the mind on mental states in this regard is just that when that urge for what we come to label as anger arises, initially it's just a sensation. And then beyond that, without the cognizance of the ordinary person, we have that conceptual elaboration or that labeling process that calls it anger. And then we consider that, as in the case of so many people, we consider that a self-existent thing. Of course, it's just the natural reaction. And So I think, there's this great value of, what we owe so much gratitude to Buddhists who have taught, throughout timeless history, is that by this close placement of the mind, we can discern that difference between, what I think I've studied correctly, that energy that arises is actually just the sport of the clear light mind, or we can just call it emptiness. And then, but we go on, based on our unknowing to label it incorrectly. And then we're imprisoned by that labeling. We think that it has some kind of inherent self nature. So um, I think and again, the great value of abandoning that imprisonment is that we can free ourselves of that label, of that conceptual elaboration by these studies, first perceptual, intellectual, and then finally, if we learn how to meditate deeply, that it arises as self-realized wisdom, and it becomes spontaneous, and we can, break that apparent bond between just that energy and how we label it, and then we can get free. But without that spontaneous arising of wisdom, I think again it all just remains conceptual, and we really can't get out of it. But anyway, lots of good thought-provoking discussion today, so thank you for that.
Contemplating what you said. It's called. It is an interesting point, isn't it? I mean, one point I'll just contemplate as you were saying that is that on the one hand, like we have to apply, this teaching everything, we apply the antidotes to the mental affliction. So take anger as the example, right? And I'll just make a couple quick points. One is there's like with anger as an example, there are many different antidotes, right? Like meditating on impermanence or love is considered an direct antidote to hatred, for example, or anger. But then, of course, the final antidote to all the mental afflictions is the wisdom. I think you said that. I think the wisdom realizing emptiness is the final antidote to all the mental afflictions, including anger. And it's an interesting question, isn't it? Like, when you meditate on. Actually, I'll just sort of say that. I mean, if you think about take anger, so we were talking about anger. So take anger as the example. So do you meditate on the emptiness of yourself as a person, or the emptiness of your own mind, or the emptiness of anger itself, or the emptiness of the object of your anger? When you're, if you're trying to overcome anger, for example, right? Is that if you're using emptiness as the example, because you have to start with you have to start with a base, right? Emptiness always starts with an object of negation, which is grasping at a certain basis, right? Um, so I guess all I'll say is, so we have to be clear, I think, which, if I'm going to use, and I think actually what's true isn't, so if we take anger as the example, like one point is we have to check, like, what level am I at? Like, taking any mental affliction example, like, because there are times where, there are times where just like, I don't know what there is. There are times where our mind is quite adept and good. Maybe you can meditate on emptiness as the antidote. There are other times where that's going to be too subtle of a practice because you're too upset, and you have to do some other, uh, use a different antidote. Um, uh, but then even within emptiness, right, there are more subtle and less subtle. There are easier and harder objects, to start with bases, right, for emptiness. And probably the easiest, it's easier. Well, they say that, right? It's easier to meditate on the emptiness of the person, of yourself. That's the first one that people usually can realize. Whereas, say, the emptiness of anger itself is a harder object, a harder basis of it for emptiness. So anyway, I was just sort of going on, but that's just sort of reflection is what's the base because you have to find the basis that you're grasping at, then identify the object of negation in that basis, and then meditate on the emptiness of that. So even with anger, you have to start with that, right? So what's the basis for emptiness that I'm going to meditate, use as my basis for meditating on emptiness, which is making me think about that. But I guess it's time, so we should stop. Unless, yeah, okay. So and I think we have class next week, don't we? I think it's scheduled for next week. Not sure I remember that right. Yeah, we do. So next week we'll start on the 4 correct abandonings, which are practices of the middle up level of the path of accumulation on to Buddhahood. And it doesn't mean we can't practice them now, but it's when we become adept at those. It's that level. So we'll like look at those, and that'll be tough next week. The supreme jewel, bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it rise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you, the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. I dedicate all these merits, which are merely labeled totally empty from their own side, to the I, who is merely labeled and totally empty from its own side. May achieve Buddha's enlightenment, which is merely labeled totally empty from its own side. In order to lead all mother sentient beings who are merely labeled totally empty from their outside to the state of enlightenment as quickly as possible. And also through these efforts, it's studying the 4 foundations of mindfulness, and all of us be able to, correctly practice them just as the bodhisattvas, Buddhas of the past did, in order to achieve the result of full enlightenment, in order to liberate all beings from suffering and its causes. Thanks, everybody.
Gabe's in charge.
Gabe, I'll let you end the recording.